Well, hello everyone. I just wanted to give you an update by video this time regarding my 2009 iMac. I have two other bake videos, for those of you who don't already know, on how to resurrect the video card in this particular series iMac. And that bake applies to model years 2009 through 2012. So far, my second bake has lasted 2 years and 6 months, 2.5 years. And that's actually quite a long time if you consider that before I was only able to get about 3 years of life even with a brand new card. I had originally purchased this brand new in late 2009. This is the i7 2.8 gigahertz top-end model. And exactly 3 years later, just after my AppleCare expired, it started having freezing and lockup problems. Ultimately, I got it resolved with Apple, and for free of charge, they replaced the video card. And that kept it working for another 3 years when, interestingly, almost, well, not to the day, but approximately 3 years later, the same thing happened again. Now, knowing Apple would not replace it again, I decided to search online, especially YouTube, to find out what might fix the problem. And I saw some people who had some very basic videos on baking the video card, something very unconventional. And to me, as an electrical engineer, I thought, well, maybe that's not even a good idea. But after watching a lot of videos on it, even though it's not a good idea for video cards in general, and you definitely would not want to do it on any kind of circuit board with an electrolytic fluid-filled capacitor, for these particular iMacs, miraculously enough, it works. So I gave it a try, and my first bake, it worked, but it only lasted 4 months. Now that seems to kind of fit the narrative that the naysayers, who often cite Louis Rossmann, if you don't know who he is, he's a very knowledgeable repair person who owns his own business and repairs a lot of MacBooks and iPhones as well. And I don't say anything negative to knock him, but he has said it's a foolish and stupid idea, amongst other profane words he prefers to use, to say it's a very stupid idea to bake the video card. And logic would tell you that it probably is. But for reasons I cannot perfectly explain, that heating of the video card, specifically the GPU chip, seems to fix problems within the chip. Now, some people say it's reflowing the solder balls underneath the chip, but actually the temperatures that are required to do the bake are not hot enough to reflow the solder. If it did reflow all the solder, you'd have components falling off the board, which is not what you want. But it is hot enough to resolve the problem in the 2009 through 2012 video cards, which unfortunately have a design defect. They're just badly designed. And so, long story short, I have two videos on the process. My first bake lasted only 4 months. However, I used inferior thermal paste and I didn't do it properly, meaning there are memory chips on the video card in addition to the GPU, and Apple had thermal pads, which are thick. It's not just a thin layer of paste, but it's a kind of a thick layer of special paste. It's a thermal pad that goes between the memory chips and the heatsink. And there's a fairly big gap, and that's also why it's a pad, because normally the heatsink and the GPU or CPU has almost no gap. It's pretty much touching, and you just want a very thin layer of paste. But for the memory chips, there's more of a gap, and so you need a thermal pad. Well, I didn't have thermal pads, and it was impossible for me to measure. And so when I first did my bake, I didn't want to clean off the thermal pads. And all I did was put on regular thermal grease on top of the gaps wherever there were little holes there. And that's how I did the first bake, the application of thermal paste. Now, of course, for the GPU, I cleaned off all of the old thermal paste on the GPU, and I applied Arctic Silver 5. And I think that was probably fine, although Arctic Silver 5, that was several years old, and you shouldn't actually repaste with very old thermal paste. So overall, I think the reason my first bake only lasted 4 months was because of my thermal paste job, as opposed to some baking type of problem. Nevertheless, 4 months later, I decided to do it again. So I went through the process, pulled everything out, did the bake again, but this time I cleaned off all of the thermal paste, all of the thermal pads, perfectly clean. I spent a long time cleaning. And I, this time, used K4 and K5 Pro, which is a thermal paste set that comes from a company in Greece, and which is interesting because it is thermal grease, right? So the best grease should come from Greece. Okay, that's just a bad joke. But nevertheless, it does work. This, again, has been working for 2.5 years. And the thermal pad replacement is actually not a thermal pad, so you don't have to measure anything. And that's why I chose it. K5 Pro is what it's called. And it's just a very thick, specialized thermal paste that can fill in a fairly large gap between the memory chips and other chips other than a GPU and CPU. The GPU and CPU are going to get very hot, and you would need the K4 Pro or some other type of specialty paste for that. But I use the K4 and K5 Pro, and lo and behold, well, my second bake is still going strong. And so I just make this as a video update this time, even though every single month I update the text description underneath the second bake video to let all of you know that, well, this iMac, it's, as you can see, this is one of my videos here. It's still going strong, and it's used every single day. My son plays a lot of 3D games on it, so it is being taxed. The only thing that I have different than before is I have a fan control app that's set up to make sure that all of the fans on the inside are running at 2,000 RPM. Now you can hear the fans a little bit more. It's not obnoxious, but you can hear them in a very, very quiet room. But it makes the machine run cooler, and I think for the longevity of the machine, that's a pretty good idea. Now, it's the year 2020 right now, and this was made at the end of 2019. So this machine is still going, okay? So all of the other components are still working fine, and it was just the video card originally that was the problem. Now, there are, under my first bake video, which has over 250,000 views as of today in January 1st, 2020, there's about 610 comments under that. I read and reply to every single comment. So thank you for your comments. Thank you for sharing your success stories. There's more than 700 comments under my second bake video, and I also read and reply to every one of those comments too. So I know that it's just not my one-off experience. A lot of the naysayers say, oh, you know, it'll never work. It's a stupid idea. It'll never last, even if it works. Well, this 2.5 years shows that's wrong. And many of them will cite Louis Rossmann. Even today, there was a person who submitted a comment and mentioned his name. Other people in the past who have lambasted me, even basically calling me a liar and trying to deceive people, they would cite Mr. Rossmann. Now, I don't want to say anything negative against him, but there are certain facts that you need to be aware of. He is quite negative against Apple, even though his business is built on repairing a lot of Apples. But he finds a lot of things that, you know, I by and large agree with a lot of what he presents on his videos. They're very detailed and shows how knowledgeable he really is. But he mostly does repairs machines that have water damage. And he even said that. There's a Linus Tech Tips video that Linus actually flew him out, and they worked on a iMac Pro together. And Rossmann admitted that was the first time he'd ever seen an iMac Pro opened. And later in the video, he even mentioned that he hadn't opened an iMac since 2012, so quite a number of years before that video was made. And that's because he works mostly on mobile devices like iPhones and notebooks, and he doesn't really have extensive experience with these iMacs. Also, I don't know if he ever tried to bake a video card before, but if he did try one with electrolytic capacitors, yes, I would agree that is a terrible idea. You'd never want to bake any type of electronics with a fluid-filled capacitor, because that would potentially cause the capacitor to leak out its fluid or evaporate some of the fluid. It's very bad for those capacitors. But for the video cards inside these series iMacs, all of them are surface mount components. So none of the components are fluid filled. And again, the heat is not hot enough to reflow all of the components. So it is actually safe to do it. Some people have said to me, well, you know, Louis has said it's a stupid idea and therefore he's right and you're wrong. Look at how many viewers, subscribers he has compared to you. He is far superior to you, JDW, and so he knows more. But that's not necessarily true. He has practical experience in a certain area, and he's trying to speculate in areas where he doesn't have experience. And I think that's not necessarily bad, but it's kind of like if you have heart disease and you go to a general practitioner and say, you operate on me. Well, he's not going to do it. He's going to send you to a specialist. And if you go to a brain surgeon, a neurologist, and say, well, work on my heart, he's not going to do it, because he deals with matters of the brain, right? Even in the medical field, you have specialists. So Louis is very specialized in a variety of machines, but by and large mobile. And so he doesn't really have all of that iMac expertise. And if you watch that video, I put a link for you down in the text description below. and I put timestamps. Don't click the timestamps because that will jump you to this video. But if you go to that video and look at the timestamps, you can see he's not, he doesn't have a vast amount of experience with these iMacs. And again, that's not a slight against him. It's just that his general advice against baking a video card does not apply to the 2009 through 2012 iMacs. And another reason I know that this bake works, it's just not me being a one-off, is all of you who have tried this. And many of you were skeptical that it would even work, but until you tried it. And you write your success stories in the comments, and more than 90%, I'd say more than 95% of you in the comments, because I read and write every comment I know, report a story of success. And usually you don't write back, which means if your card fails in the future, you will write back. Now, there are some people who did write back and say it failed. And I usually ask them, what kind of paste did you use? And more often than not, they'd say, well, I didn't use K4 and K5 Pro like you did. So it could be just like my first bake, it could be a thermal paste issue. And that's why I recommend, not because I get a kickback, I don't get any kickbacks for the thermal paste. I recommend K4 and K5 Pro because, again, 2.5 years. I know from practical experience of using this computer every day. My son plays a lot of 3D games, and yet this machine is still going strong. It's still going strong. And so that's why I can safely suggest it, because I know from my own experience it's working, and because of all the hundreds and hundreds of people who have tried it and found success. And month after month, it continues to be operational for them. And so that's why I would say to the naysayers out there, you really don't have practical experience to know what you're talking about. General advice would tell you, yeah, the bake is bad. But in this case, it's not. Now, the last thing I will say before I close out this video is that some people say, what about a heat gun? Can't I use a heat gun? Why don't you suggest a heat gun? Localized heat would be better. Well, not everybody has a heat gun. And I would prefer to give advice to people who, well, advice that could be used by pretty much anyone. Pretty much anyone has access to an oven, you know, but not everyone has access to a heat gun. Plus, heat guns can be dangerous. They generate a lot of heat, and if you don't focus that heat well, you may desolder other components, or you may desolder something you shouldn't desolder. Actually, this entire heating is not to desolder things. It is to sufficiently heat the GPU chip and repair damage internal to that chip. That's what it's all about. And so I would say it's much safer for the average person to use an oven. Now, it's just not a matter of an oven. You need to watch my videos, and you need to have little tinfoil standoffs and kind of pick it up and make sure that the heat can flow around your actual video card. And you definitely need to go all through and watch all of my advice, you know, and use all the tools. But if you basically all said, if you do it like I show you how to do it, then more often than not, you're going to have success. And besides, these machines are so old, what do you have to lose, right? That's the way I viewed it. Am I going to go to Apple and pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars to get this thing fixed? No, I wouldn't do that. Well, if I'm not going to do a bake, what would I do? Well, either live without a computer or buy a brand new one. And you might say to me, well, do the new ones have the same problem? As far as I know, from 2015 and later, they don't. Because I have a 5K iMac made in late 2015. I've been using that since late 2015 at the office every day. And it runs very quiet. It never gets really hot, not even with Final Cut Pro rendering going on. And the fans stay fairly quiet. It's never had a problem. So the internal design is quite a bit different. The video card is quite a bit different. So if you do buy a new iMac, you really don't have much to worry about. But for the 2009 through 2012 models, unfortunately, they do have this problem. And again, the symptoms are many. Some of you have asked, oh, I have an all-white screen. I have an all-black screen. Does that mean the video card is a problem? Doesn't that mean something else? There are a variety of symptoms. It could be an all-black screen. It could be an all-white screen. It could be artifacts on the screen. It could be random freezes. Maybe you try to wake it up from sleep and you'll see it show something on the screen, but it doesn't fully wake up. It just freezes. And then you'll restart the machine and maybe it'll lock up during boot. There's a variety of symptoms like that, but all of them point back to the video card. I'm not giving a guarantee that in every situation, every possible problem is related to the video card, but for those series machines, most of the problems that cause lockups and freezes and random artifacts or strange things on the screen pertain to the video card, and unfortunately that means you need to remove the front glass and, well, follow my video procedure to do the bake. But once you do the bake, I think you can be fairly confident, so long as you use good thermal paste like I recommend, that the bake will work and that you will have success in that. So again, please don't give too much credence to Louis Rossmann and his advice. I'm not saying don't watch him. I think a lot of his videos are great, and I respect him as a person, but he just doesn't have experience for these particular cards, and a lot of the naysayers don't either. They're just listening to hearsay and saying, well, it's a bad idea in general. But it actually does work. And so that's what I wanted to say today. 2.5 years and still going strong. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting this channel. And I wish each and every one of you a Happy New Year in 2020.